respect for free speech are intertwined and interdependent. But like any healthy ecological system, this relationship needs constant nurturing. This is why this issue of Index is themed around environmental justice with a particular focus on indigenous campaigners. It's why we are here today. It's also no coincidence that we're publishing on the eve of the United Nations Climate Conference, COP26, to be held in Glasgow next month. The latest edition of the magazine concentrates on the people whose voices have often been forgotten, the indigenous peoples of Australia, Africa, the United States, and Latin America. I mention our 50th anniversary to highlight how much has changed in the world of free speech activism since the magazine launched in 1972. I've been looking through old editions, and there was almost no discussion of the Green movement in those early days. It's easy to lose hope and get despondent, but I would suggest that it's a positive development that organizations such as Index are finally recognizing the importance of speaking up for the rights of environmental campaigners. Today's event, we will be concentrating on Ecuador, which can act as something of a case study. As one of our guests today, Bethany Pitts, writes in her piece for the magazine, Ecuador is not a safe country for environmental defenders. They are criminalized, threatened, attacked, and even assassinated for attempting to uphold the rights of nature decreed in the Constitution. I'm delighted to welcome Bethany today. She is a writer and activist who's been working with indigenous communities in Ecuador since 2013, especially those defending the Amazon from oil exploitation. It was while she was in the Amazon researching a guidebook to Ecuador with a focus on ethical travel that she first met our second guest, Jimmy Piowaje. Jimmy is an indigenous defender and filmmaker of Siocapai nationality from the northeast of Ecuador. He's the co-founder of the Sarah Foundation, a grassroots organization created by a group of young people in the community to preserve their ancestral knowledge via audiovisual techniques and education. And finally, Steven Donziger is an American lawyer who helped indigenous campaigners win a multi-billion-dollar judgment against US oil giant Chevron in 2011 for polluting ancestral lands. Since then, he's been targeted in a series of so-called kill step actions by Chevron designed to neutralize him. He currently finds himself effectively under house arrest and facing a lengthy jail sentence as a result. So we're going to, just to let people know, we're going to begin this evening with a discussion between Bethany Pitts and Jimmy. We will then move on to bringing Stephen into the discussion, and throughout the discussion, please, members of the audience, do post questions in the chat, and we will come to them towards the end of this evening's event. So I'm now going to hand over to Bethany, who, as Jimmy is not a native English speaker, will be translating for Jimmy, and will be translating Jimmy for those of us who are English speakers. Thank you, Bethany.
Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. Thank you so much to Index on Censorship for platforming Jimmy's voice, a really rarely heard perspective. I'm really excited to be here. So I'm just going to start off by reading a small excerpt from my article, which is about Jimmy and his community. So Jimmy Piowaje is a young indigenous Siocapai defender from Sequoia Remolino, a community of 53 families living on the banks of the Agua Rico River in the northeastern Ecuadorian Amazon region. The Siocapai, which means multicolored people, are renowned for their shamanic acumen and knowledge of medicinal plants, with uses for more than 1,000 different plants. In the 1600s, when Jesuit missionaries arrived in Siocapai territory, there were between 30,000 and 40,000 Siocapai in the zone between Putumayo, the Agua Rico River, Inapo, and Napo. Traditionally, the Sekopai lived communally in gigantic malokas, or open-sided wooden huts, with 40 to 60 families living in each hut. Coexistence meant that people did everything together. Everyone got up at around 3 a.m. to prepare and drink yoko, which is a drink a little bit like coffee, twist threads of chambira, which is a palm which is used to make hammocks, and tell stories. The women would discuss what they would do that day, what the future would bring. The children would be there too, learning from their parents and elders. The missionaries brought illnesses such as measles, wiping out 90% of the population. Whole peoples and clans disappeared. The few who survived did so by hiding in the depths of the jungle. Then the rubber tappers arrived and removed the Sekopai from there too. Currently, only around 1,600 Sekopai remain, 900 in Peru and 700 in Ecuador, where they live in a 50,000-acre fragment of rainforest. So that's a little bit about Jimmy. Is Jimmy still with us?
No, unfortunately, we seem to have just lost Jimmy just at the crucial moment. So I think perhaps while we're waiting for Jimmy to rejoin, perhaps I'll just ask a couple of questions to you, Bethany, and maybe to you, Stephen, just about your background in this area. Now, we said in your introduction, Bethany, that you'd come to this activism through working and writing in Ecuador. Maybe you could just tell us a little bit more about that.
Yes, I was inspired to write my book, which is the only guidebook on Ecuador with a focus on ethical travel, by my work with indigenous activists, especially a nationality or a group who've been at the forefront of the battle against oil exploitation in the Amazon. And I've been working with them since 2013. They're called Sarayaku. And it was when this Jose Gualenga, who was then the president of Sarayaku, explained to me that community-led ecotourism is often provides the only or a very rare source of sustainable income for them, that I was inspired to write my book. So I spent a year traveling around the country looking for community-led ecotourism projects in particular. And that's when I met Jimmy Piowahe. I was up in the northern Amazon region and asked an activist I know up there if she could recommend me community-led ecotourism initiatives run by indigenous defenders, and she recommended that I speak to Jimmy Piowahe, and I met Jimmy in 2018. And of all the activists I met in that whole year I was traveling, Jimmy was the person who inspired me the most. So I've been working to support his projects ever since.
Yes, I mean, hopefully Jimmy hasn't been silenced or censored as we came on air. But perhaps, Stephen, I could just come to you and just ask you briefly to talk about your involvement with indigenous people and how you came to this.
Sure. Thank you, Martin, and thank you, Bethany. I first went to this region of Ecuador, the Amazon region of Ecuador, where Jimmy's people live and have lived for millennia, back in 1993, a while back. And I've been back a couple of hundred times since, working mostly on a legal case to hold Texaco, now Chevron, accountable for oil pollution that impacts the indigenous groups down there, as well as the rural farmer communities, the environment, the ecosystem. So I have quite a bit of experience in the region. And I've been, I've spent time with the Sekopai and over the years. And even though I'm kind of in a difficult situation now in Manhattan, where I'm, in under house arrest now for over 2 years because of these Chevron legal attacks on me. I'm really happy to have done the work I've done, and I'm happy to share my perspective with your audience today.
Thank you very much. And while we're still waiting for Jimmy, we are emailing him and we're trying to get back into contact with him. It's not necessarily the easiest thing for him to maintain the contact. I mean, perhaps it would be interesting for, I know that Bethany, you and Stephen, I don't think have talked or met before. I would be very interested to have your perspective, Bethany, on the plight of Steven Donziger and what you make of the extraordinary attacks that Chevron and their lawyers have conducted to silence this kind of campaigning.
I haven't met Steven before, but I have listened to numerous interviews with you, Steven, most recently on Democracy Now! And it just seems to be an outrageous and unprecedented attack and an attempt to intimidate other people who feel tempted to speak up against oil giants such as Chevron Texaco.
And what is the latest state of play, Stephen? I mean, what's the latest state of play, both with your case and with the whole point of your actions was to bring some sort of justice to the people of Ecuador. So what's the situation? Where do you find yourself, and where do they find themselves?
Well, I want to say, I think my situation in the larger case, which is not my case, I'll remind people it's a case that's owned by the communities in Ecuador who won the lawsuit with my help and the help of other lawyers. But I mean, I think this case really implicates the theme of this panel, which is, climate of fear and speech. And, you said something at the top, Martin, that I think resonated with me, which is, the issue of saving the planet and free speech are completely intertwined. And I think what's happening to me is an example of how close they really are. Because I think the attacks on me, which are by extension attacks on the communities in Ecuador that I've helped, are really primarily intended by Chevron to silence speech, to silence the ability to hold a major polluter accountable for environmental crimes committed against very vulnerable communities, including Jimmy's. And to discourage, really weaponize the law to intimidate and discourage other lawyers and activists from doing this critically important frontline work to save the planet. And a lot of this work has to happen by necessity through courts and through the law. And if the very laws that are intended to protect people are turned against those who speak out, like myself, we're in a lot of, in my opinion, very serious trouble. As for the Ecuadorians, which I consider critically important, there's been a mass industrial poisoning, unfortunately, of a very large part of Ecuador's Amazon. Many people are exposed on a daily basis to contaminated water. Rivers and streams have been used as repositories for cancer-causing waste dumped by Chevron, as found by courts. And people are suffering. A lot of people have died already. Others will die because of exposures to these toxins, mostly of cancer. Cancer rates in the region are off the charts. The indigenous groups never even had the word cancer in their languages until Texaco showed up and started dumping. I mean, it was just unheard of. And now thousands of people have either died or are really threatened by these exposures. The legal case, though, is valid, it's viable. There's lawyers other than me working to enforce the judgment won in Ecuador. By the way, Ecuador was a court system that where Chevron insisted the trial be held and where Chevron accepted jurisdiction. The communities won the case. Chevron refused to pay, which has necessitated them hiring other lawyers in other jurisdictions to go after Chevron's assets to force the company to comply with the rule of law. And that's a long process that's still happening. And I think ultimately the communities will get there regardless of what happens to me. As regards me, Chevron went to a US federal judge, a former tobacco lawyer, and demanded access to my computer, my case file. I refused to turn it over on the grounds of attorney-client privilege. I appealed the order, and while that order was on appeal, a trial judge charging with criminal contempt of court for not complying with an order that I was appealing. Unheard of. Never happened before in the history of our legal system here in the United States. He then proceeded to appoint a friend of his, a judge who is a member of the Chevron funded Federalist Society. And he appointed a private law firm to prosecute me. And the law firm had Chevron as a client. They promptly locked me up at home with an ankle bracelet on August 6, 2019, where I've been ever since. Today is the 806th day of my detention. And I want to emphasize how unusual this is. I mean, this is a misdemeanor, the lowest level possible offense in the United States. The longest sentence ever given a lawyer convicted of a misdemeanor is 90 days of home confinement. Again, I've already served over 9 times that amount. And on top of that, she's trying to put me in prison. Judge Preska is for 6 months. And she's trying to maneuver me into a very dangerous prison. We've appealed it. We're desperately trying to get the appellate court here to intervene and stop me going to prison. The other thing I'd add is the United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention just issued a decision against the US government, calling my detention arbitrary and in violation of international law, and demanded my release and compensation. The judge ignored that ruling. Now we're urging the Biden administration and the Attorney General of the United States to act on it and ensure that I do not only not go to prison, but get released. But the thing I want to really say ultimately is, you know, obviously my situation, the situation of the communities in Ecuador who won the legal case, the environmental legal case, is very connected, but they're not one and the same. The people of Ecuador have an independent case. It does not involve me. They have their own lawyers, and hopefully they will prevail with those lawyers in other jurisdictions. However, I have worked with these communities now for 28 years. I think I have their confidence. And their lawyer of choice, meaning me, or one of their lawyers, has been deprived from them, has been taken from them because of these attacks intended to silence this type of advocacy work and this type of free speech. So, you know, I think this playbook that is being applied to me, and I do call it a playbook, I think it's been used against others and will be used in the future if it's not stopped, implicates free speech to a great degree. And if we let them get away with it here, it's going to be, in my opinion, very difficult to do the advocacy necessary to save the planet.
Thank you, Stephen. That's hugely interesting. I think it's absolutely crucial that we make this distinction between your case and the case that's still ongoing of the indigenous people of Ecuador. I'm just wondering, Bethany, whether there's any possibility that you could fill us in a little bit on. I know we're still trying to get hold of Jimmy, but anyway, you could fill us in a little bit with the latest situation for Jimmy's people, as far as you know it, as someone who's very close to this community.
Of course. So Jimmy's community is basically surrounded by oil fields and monoculture oil palm plantations, and their territory is contaminated by the oil industry, also by runoff from the oil palm industry. They are struggling to find animals to hunt in their territory. There are almost no fish in the rivers, and people from outside come in to log, to hunt, to fish. So they're really fighting for their survival. And I mean, the case of Chevron Texaco is well known. I think what is probably less well known is that oil companies, especially the state oil company, continues to exploit the Ecuadorian Amazon. And although the damage isn't as extreme as it was by Chevron Texaco, it still continues. The contamination continues. They are working by dividing communities. So communities that were previously united are now divided, because that's what the oil companies are experts in doing that, sadly. And Jimmy's community is currently in resistance. the state oil company currently wants to build a highway through their territory. They continue to resist that. And it's only their resistance which is preventing the state oil company from exploiting the Amazon all the way to the border with Peru. And they're in a very difficult position because they see that their neighboring communities, for example, each family makes $500 a month from felling their Amazon and planting oil palm. And they want to continue protecting their piece of Amazon. But what they're lacking is sustainable alternative sources of money, basically, to live. So that's kind of their current situation.
We have got a question from one of the audience asking whether the Ecuadorian government is complicit in the silencing of indigenous people in the country, or is it a more complicated relationship than that? And as a sort of follow-up, what can the international community do to put pressure on the government of Ecuador? Oh, you're muted.
Bethany, you want to go first, maybe?
So please go for it, Stephen.
What I would say is it's complicated, but generally speaking, look, in the 28 years I've been going to Ecuador, I've seen 13 different presidents. Literally every single one, to some degree or another, has tried to put forth a fossil fuel agenda that has created enormous conflict with indigenous groups, and I think really hurt the interests of the environment and indigenous rights. But it varies, and it's obviously more complex than that, because there are certain governments that try to do certain things to ameliorate the situation, or to put forth agendas that at least purport to take account of indigenous rights. But it's the fundamental problem is the communities are not, the government has the rights to the subsoil, meaning they can sell what's underneath indigenous territory without having to go through a consent process, even though they're required to by law, with the indigenous groups. And that's where the conflict lies. The indigenous groups by law do not own the subsoil rights to their own land, and they should. And if they did, there would be no conflict. My guess is all of them, or mostly all of them, would never allow a Chevron or a Texaco, an oil company, Petroecuador, to go in and drill on their land, because why? And Bethany talked about the need for income sources, which are critical. But before oil came, these indigenous peoples had no money, and they were rich. I talk about this a lot. I talk to young students. I'll say, can you imagine being rich and having no money? Come up with a way you can be rich and have no money. And people in the United States, at least, just get befuddled. They cannot figure out how to answer that. But the reality is, before the oil companies and the missionaries showed up, these indigenous peoples, including Jimmy's people, were living in prosperity for millennia. They had everything: clean water, clean air, medicines, and material for shelter, and their cultures flourished. And in a few short years, because of the deliberate toxic dumping of Texaco, and by the way, I want to emphasize that what happened down there in terms of our lawsuit was not an accident, it was not a spill, it was an engineering design to offload production costs by dumping. It was all poison. And all of the economic pressures now that these communities feel, including generated by a need to deal with the African palm industry, as Bethany points out, are a function of this original sin, of the despoilation of this beautiful, pristine ecosystem that was a life force, not only for the indigenous groups that live there, but for all of us, for the planet. So, I'm just like a latecomer lawyer trying to cure a problem and help some people. Okay, it's not that complicated. But the work to make sure this doesn't happen again through the law is critical. And, you know, I would argue the reason I'm locked up, I mean, first of all, being locked up for what I did, I didn't do anything wrong. But the way they manipulated the law to lock me up shows the extent to which this kind of work is so threatening to the fossil fuel industry, doesn't it? I mean, the fact they have to engage in such extreme measures to shut down one lawyer tells you how threatened they are by the Jimmys of the world, by Bethany, by all the other leaders, not only in Ecuador, but in Brazil and other countries where these rapacious oil companies just want to extract more and more oil and for money, you know, while leaving all the impacts of the pollution behind to be borne by the vulnerable communities that live around there. So, you know, the government of Ecuador, I think, has been complicit with Chevron and Texaco in destroying their own country. You know, I mean, they frame it as we need revenue. We need oil revenue to do all sorts of things. And I get it. It's complicated. Yes, I get it. Okay. You do want revenue, but you cannot work your way out of debt problems and into a positive revenue stance, in my opinion, by trampling on the rights of indigenous peoples who are the frontline defenders of our planet. So the government of Ecuador needs to do better. But more importantly, the fossil fuel industry needs to stay the heck out of the rainforest and really reassess its entire approach.
All disconnected now. I think I froze a little bit there. I'm really sorry. I hope people can hear me. So Bethany, I don't know whether you want to respond to that. I have got a question directly for you from one of the audience members. But if you wanted to just respond to Stephen, I'd be happy for you to do so.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that the current president, Guillermo Lasso, has just announced that he's planning to double oil production from Ecuador, and that will be coming probably from the oil blocks within the Amazon. So that's really not good news for the indigenous people of Ecuador. You know, and that includes the oil blocks within the Yasuni National Park, which is arguably the most biodiverse place in the whole planet. Mm-hmm. And actually it's considered ethnocide to exploit for oil there, because there are two uncontacted tribes still living in the national park, and yet the government is going ahead with oil drilling there against the wishes of the Ecuadorian people who voted in a referendum to not exploit for oil within the Yasuni National Park. So the future is not looking good.
I was going to actually come to a question from Alex Lockwood, who is actually a former volunteer with Index on Censorship back in 1999-2000, who points out that while he was compiling index attacks against South Asian journalists, he remembers many of those attacks were against environmental journalists. So certainly by that stage, Index was beginning to track the chilling effect of this kind of operation on environmental activists. So I stand corrected there, Alex. But he wanted to say how inspiring it is to hear from our speakers today. And he wanted to hear more about the link between Jimmy's community and its spirituality and free speech. Now, I know that when Jimmy was on the call earlier, just before we came online, he was very keen to say that it wasn't just he who was present today or was intending to be present today, but his ancestors. And this is a slightly alien concept to most of us on this call today. But as Alex has raised the issue of the community's spirituality, I thought maybe Bethany, you could talk a little bit about that to help us understand.
Yes, I mean, it's not just Jimmy's community, but you know, indigenous communities internationally who feel very much that their resistance comes, and their strength to keep resisting comes from their ancestors. I spoke with a young Kofan activist, that's another nationality from Ecuador's northern Amazon region. She's an amazing woman, and she is actually the only woman in her community's territorial guard. And she was telling me that when the missionaries came and most of the Kofan people were wiped out by disease, some of their ancestors decided to become invisible. And they did that by using body paints. I think it was the achiote fruit, which they rubbed on their bodies, and they drank ayahuasca in a ceremony, and they decided to become invisible. And this young Kofani activist is telling me that when they take ayahuasca now, within their territory, you can still see these invisible ancestors who are basically kind of cheerleading them on in their resistance and saying, don't give up. We want to keep living. We want you to keep protecting our territory. So it's not just Jimmy's community, but, you know, indigenous communities worldwide, really, who rely on the strength that comes from their ancestors.
Thank you very much, Bethany. And I was wondering, as we're still struggling, I think, to get Jimmy back, and we are trying, everyone, we really are. Perhaps it might be a thought, as you have quoted Jimmy extensively in your piece, and thank you very much for reading that very moving introduction to him, just as he disappeared. Perhaps maybe you should read some of his words to you, because they are equally, I think, very revealing and important. You might have to do a little bit of editing on the hoof, but perhaps, you know, reading some of his words would help us have him, at least through his words, in person today.
Yes, of course. So I'll just read a little bit about the threats to Jimmy's territory and how he feels about them. He says, "We feel very threatened, very worried, because our territory is very small and we are surrounded by oil exploitation and monoculture agriculture. I know from talking with my father, with our elders, how our territory used to be. Now we have almost no resources, almost no fish, no animals to hunt. Our rivers are contaminated by toxic waste from the oil palm industry. Lack of food sovereignty is a really big worry. These are the threats that we are facing. All of these things have made us think about where we are going. Will our culture survive another 5, 10, 20 years, or will we just die?"
And he goes on in the piece to explain that the pandemic has had a deep impact on his people too. Maybe it'd be worth just reading a little bit of that too.
Yes, he says, in the Ecuadorian Amazon, the Secopai nationality was the first to confirm positive cases of COVID-19. A wise elder who died of COVID, a family member of mine, knew a lot about medicinal plants. That was a major blow for the Secopai because there aren't many of us and we all know each other. Then a teacher died. He had long been involved in the struggle to defend our culture. It was a very difficult situation. They contacted the national and local governments, but received no response. And then Jimmy goes on to say, "We started to realize that the medicine from outside wasn't helping us. Faced with many cases of COVID, we started to look to medicinal plants. In the end, the majority of people who survived were treated with medicinal plants, and we're still treating people with plant infusions, such as ajo del monte, chinchona, y cedros, with good results. This has led to some very important reflections within the Secopai communities, a rediscovery and appreciation and faith in our own ancestral medicines. And when everything collapsed in the outside world, although we were affected, we were more or less okay. This has been a deep reflection for us, seeing how the rest of the world is suffering and realizing what is important." And after that, Jimmy actually went on to make a documentary about the Secopai's use of medicinal plants within the pandemic. And their medicine was actually so effective that they were giving it to other nationalities within the Amazon region. And then Jimmy made a documentary about that, and it was published in the New Yorker.
I mean, perhaps we can put afterwards in the groups a link to that documentary. We'll try and do that. And we have I mean, thank you very much for that, Bethany. I think that was, I mean, that's an extraordinarily revealing interview with him there, and gives us a whole different understanding of the relationship of indigenous people to their land, the land which is being destroyed. Now we have a question for Steven from the audience. Stephen, you mentioned that the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention has intervened in your case. Have they intervened in Ecuador? And what is being done by international organizations there? Is the question.
So the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention has intervened only as regards the US government, and it's via its mistreatment of me. And that's sort of its very narrow mandate. It helps people who are detained in violation of international law, which is my situation. As regards Ecuador and the underlying problem, the United Nations has not intervened, and international community or bodies have really not done much of anything, unfortunately. I think a lot of groups are just assuming that because the legal case existed and was playing out, that's what would decide the whole thing. So they haven't really taken actions. I do think that the situation on the ground in the Amazon is an intense humanitarian crisis. I believe that what Chevron did is the very definition of ecocide, meaning they deliberately took acts to, for purposes of making more money that they knew would destroy the environment in a way that couldn't sustain life, as the indigenous groups had known it for millennia. So the crimes there are quite severe. The lack of attention by the international community is unfortunate, and I think a function of lots of factors, including the fact that a lot of the big media entities in the United States just don't think of Ecuador as a place of significance. The BP spill in the Gulf of Mexico in 2010, the BP oil spill, which was an accident as opposed to a deliberate dumping as what happened in Ecuador, it was a terrible spill, had only a fraction of the impact in the United States that what Chevron did in Ecuador has had on the people of Ecuador, yet it got 100 times the media coverage, and BP ended up paying around 70 billion US in compensation and fines. Whereas in Ecuador, it's much, much worse, the problem: delicate ecosystem, vulnerable communities, indigenous groups, the rainforest, and nothing's happened for 50 years. Chevron has not even paid $1, and the US media virtually ignores the story. So we need more attention. We need the international organizations and NGOs to come in. We have had many groups like Amnesty International, Global Witness, Amazon Watch and Rainforest Action Network and Greenpeace USA. Many groups have paid attention to this, but I would say there's far more attention being paid to the curiosity of Steven Donziger and his detention than there is being paid to the fact that literally tens of thousands of indigenous peoples have either died or are in imminent risk of dying because of this poison that Chevron dumped into their environment in an effort to increase its profits.
Thanks very much. We have now put the link to the documentary, the New Yorker documentary, into the chat, so people can link to that now. I'd like to return, because we've had a question about it, to this idea of the interweaving and interdependence of free expression and climate activism. Stephen spoke about this briefly, but it would be good, I think, to maybe expand on this a little bit. I think there is. I mean, the reason I wrote about that in my editorial is that I felt since, being a rather recent arrival, much more recent than both of you, to thinking about these issues, it strikes me that the wider ecology, whether it's the economic ecology of the Bethany spoke about the monoculture of some of the economy in Ecuador. So thinking more widely about the economic ecology and the ecology of free speech, should we be thinking more widely about the nature of environmental activism, that it is about the wider ecology of our human relations? maybe that's a question for Bethany. Oh.
Just saying, I'm happy for you to go with that one, Stephen.
What's that? I'm sorry. Did you ask me to speak?
Yes, Bethany said maybe you could address
Okay,
that.
sure. Thank you, Bethany. I mean, look, I think that without free speech, the planet is doomed. Okay, because without free speech, when I say free speech, I mean the ability to talk freely and organize politically and advocate legally and politically, among other things. So all of that is in the United States is what we call First Amendment protected speech. And when you get in the way of that, you really diminish the capacity of the citizenry to create the change needed for us to have a better society, and in terms of the climate issue, to have a planet free of a planet that can sustain human life. So I don't think it's any accident that as the fossil fuel industry tries to preserve its privileges and its profits and its subsidies that have existed for so long, that it's attacking speech, because it simply doesn't want people like me and Jessica Resniak, who just got sentenced to 8 years, if you can believe it, for an act of civil disobedience at an oil pipeline in the state of Iowa, okay? And others, protesters at the Line 3 pipeline in Minnesota or Standing Rock, who are being prosecuted criminally and put in jail for engaging in acts of civil disobedience. It all kind of connects up. And I think it really makes the work, Martin, of your magazine and those who believe in free speech all the more important, because I think you're going to see more and more of this playbook. What are they really trying to do to me? Okay. I don't even think it's personal. I mean, I think there's some resentment toward me and Chevron, because we've been very good at our work and we've held them accountable to a great degree. But I really think this is more about trying to find people you can target as a way to intimidate the next generation into staying away from this work. And I think that's very dangerous, because if people don't do the frontline work and aren't protected by the law from reprisal, then the fossil fuel industry is going to have its way. And I think the acceleration of global warming will pick up, and it's going to cause great harm to many people around the world.
Thanks very much. I suppose what I was getting at in my very kind of garbled and unclear way, Bethany, was that in the work that we've been doing in the magazine with campaigners, for instance, in Angola, it's very clear that the oil industry and the dominance of the oil industry within that economy means that almost everything else within that economy dies. And it struck me that when you were talking about what's happening in Ecuador and in these parts of Ecuador, you're seeing a similar pattern where it's not just the oil itself that is polluting, it's the economic relationships which are polluting the country as well. And I just wonder whether you could talk a little bit more about how you've witnessed that, the fact that the economy itself is a problem for the people of Ecuador.
Well, I know, for example, the communities that are neighboring to Jimmy, who have allowed oil exploitation in their territory, they do have more money, but they also are suffering. The youth have a massive problems with drug addiction, with alcohol, and they're kind of spiritually lost. So it's kind of causing a great spiritual contamination as well. And then when an oil company comes to a community and says, if you allow us to exploit in your territory, we'll give your children scholarships, we'll give you good jobs, we'll improve your infrastructure, then that divides the community, because some of the community believe that, and they want those things. These needs, as Stephen was saying, which have been introduced from the outside. The indigenous people didn't used to have these needs, but now they do. They've been introduced from the outside. So now they do need to participate in some way in the global economy in order to survive, which is really sad. But some of these, some of the indigenous people believe the oil companies when they say we're going to give your children scholarships. And then none of these things actually appear, So they end up with contaminated land, no jobs, no scholarships, and by then the damage is done, really. And I mean, on an economic level, something I saw traveling the country was, you know, not just oil, but also with mining, this massive, you know, focus on exploitative industries in Ecuador is really killing the tourism industry. I mean, Ecuador is, I mean, I've traveled all over the world. I've lived here for the last 10 years. It's the most amazing country, which is why I've decided to live here. It's so diverse. It's just the most beautiful paradise. And it's, you know, if the government continues with its, you know, focus on oil exploitation and mining, you know, the ecotourism industry won't be able to survive because, you know, the country will be destroyed, and that's really sad.
No, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, do you think there are some lessons to be learned here? I mean, I mean, I'm afraid I'm coming out of this discussion feeling pretty pessimistic, I have to say. But are there lessons to be learned from the long campaigns we've seen? Are there lessons to be learned from what's happened to you, Stephen? Would you do things differently if you had your time again? You know, are there ways that we can take these terrible examples and apply them elsewhere?
Well, my answer is, let's not overplay the negative, because there's a lot of positive. And I want to, you know, maybe I need to focus on that a little bit. I mean, first of all, I smile and I'm fine, and I have a great family, solidarity all over the world. Martin, it's great to meet you this year, and Bethany, and we're going to be okay. Okay. What's happening to me is their desperation, not mine. They feel risk because of the work the communities of Ecuador, in this particular case, have done to hold them accountable. And we must remember that this is happening to me because we won, not because we lost or did something wrong. You know, the case in Ecuador has been affirmed by 28 different appellate judges, 6 appellate courts, 2 Supreme Courts, 1 in Ecuador and 1 in Canada. Okay, so let's remember that this is an historic accomplishment, and there's still a ways to go to get the money to do the cleanup. I get that, that is critical, but you cannot deny that there's been a major level of accountability already imposed on Chevron, just given how far the communities have come since 28 years ago when they first filed the case. Meaning Chevron has used 60 law firms, they paid $3 billion in legal fees, and that stings, that hurts. They're going after me in this, I think, nakedly corrupt way, because the risk that in my advocacy, in my ability to raise money for my clients in Ecuador to hire lawyers in other jurisdictions, poses to them. So they're feeling heat, they're feeling risk, and I would argue that that is real accountability that we should all be really proud of. And, you know, just because, like, you look at my situation, like, wow, that really stinks, you know, they put that guy under house arrest. I mean, listen, we're fighting this. We have appellate courts here, and we have forums to speak out. And I believe ultimately this will work out for me. I really do. And I think I personally and the communities are going to be stronger for the experience. And I think ultimately Chevron is going to be paying this judgment. So this is sort of that period of time where it's tough, and they try to use these things. Chevron tries to, and their law firms try to use these experiences to convince the world that they've won and we've lost. Nothing could be further from the truth. We won, they lost, therefore they're attacking us, and they're weaponizing the law to do so. It does have implications that go well beyond this case that I've talked about in this forum that people need to be aware of, because we can't let them continue to operate this way. But we do have to appreciate and recognize the incredible accomplishments of the people of Ecuador and their legal team in getting a $10 billion judgment against one of the world's major polluters that's been affirmed by 2 Supreme Courts. That's pretty cool. That's never happened before.
Bethany, do you see any positives?
Yeah, I mean, something which I'm always so inspired. One of the major ways in which Jimmy inspires me is that he never loses hope. He's always positive. And I think that's absolutely amazing, you know. And he and a group of young people from his community have come up with some really innovative projects. And while, you know, he can still have hope after kind of centuries of you know, being wiped out with disease, having their territory stolen, being enslaved. If he can still have hope after all of that, I definitely can. And if it's okay, I'd like to read a little bit, an excerpt from my article, with Jimmy talking about the work that he's currently doing, which gives him hope. Is that okay?
Absolutely. I mean, we know that he is trying to get back on. Apparently there was a storm, is that right, Bethany? And
Yeah,
knocked the internet out. So
yeah, there was a storm. And
so
it knocked
nothing
the internet out.
conspiratorial. It was just an act of nature, I'm afraid. Yeah, Bethany, of course, yes. As many words of from Jimmy as possible.
So Jimmy has identified two kind of main tools which he likes to use in his resistance. One of them is audiovisual, and the other one is education. So he's trained as a documentary maker, and he actually the first project of his foundation, which is called the Sarah Foundation, was to start going out with his community's shamans and elders while they are collecting medicinal plants, because these elders are dying without leaving a legacy. So he started to safeguard this knowledge using audiovisual. And he says, together with another young Sekopai defender, I created a project to safeguard their knowledge with videos. We go out with them when they are harvesting plants and record them, talking about how they identify and use them. This project brought our group of young leaders together. And then they started to move into the area of education. So they've been running school workshops to promote environmental awareness through intergenerational exchange. So they bring together the elders, the parents and the children in workshops. And he says, we talk about ancestral knowledge, the identification and uses of medicinal plants, the threats that we face. We ask, what is important to us? What do we want to preserve, the Sekopai? The aim is to instill in the children the consciousness that our territory matters, that they should have respect for the elders, for Mother Nature, for our own cosmovision, which is their worldview. We know that the children are like seeds. If we plant in them the idea that they must cut down the jungle to plant oil palm, they will want to do that. But instead, we are saying to them, we must take care of the jungle. This is our wealth. There are other ways to do things to survive. That's why I think education is so important. So it's definitely not all bleak. Jimmy and his colleagues are working on some innovative projects which give them hope and which give me hope too, which is why I've been working with them for the last couple of years.
Thank you very much for that. I mean, there is a sense, as one of our audience has said, that there does seem to be a general understanding that oil companies are now on the wrong side of history, even among the oil companies themselves, who clearly are trying to diversify and desperately trying to persuade the world that that they are on the side of good and on the side of renewable energy, which I suppose feeds back to Stephen's point about perhaps them knowing that that they're wrong and that they've been beaten. And here I think we may have Jimmy coming back to us, which would be a wonderful circular ending to the to today's event. Bethany, do you want to try and talk to Jimmy?
No puedo encender mi cámara, algo.
Hola, Jimmy.
Vaya. Le pido mil disculpas a todos, una tormenta de lluvia llegó y se apagó todo. Le pido mil disculpas.
Jimmy says, 1,000 apologies. A massive rainstorm came and knocked out the internet. He's really sorry.
Do you want to explain that? Well, I will say that Bethany has done you proud by reading long passages from your words from the article that she wrote for Index on Censorship. So we've been hearing your words.
Estuvimos escuchando tus palabras, Jimmy, porque yo estuve leyendo tus palabras desde el artículo. Entonces, hemos escuchado algunas de tus palabras.
Perhaps we can just, for the last 5 or 10 minutes of the discussion, at which point I think we unfortunately have to end this. Perhaps Beth, we could hear a little bit from Jimmy. And in particular, I'm very keen, because he was very keen to emphasize the importance of the presence of his ancestors. So maybe we could talk a little bit about that.
Para terminar, Jimmy, tal vez quieres decirnos algo sobre tus ancestros y cómo tus ancestros te dan como la fuerza para seguir como resistiendo.
Sí, bueno, yo soy de esta región y he crecido aquí. Y yo creo que la resistencia de mi pueblo son las plantas medicinales, como la planta maestra que es el yagé, que mis ancestros adquirían tomando el yagé sus conocimientos y sabiduría.
Jimmy was saying that for him, the medicinal plants that were used by his ancestors form a key part of their resistance, especially yagé, which is known by us by the name of ayahuasca. ¿Quieres seguir, Jimmy?
Y también, sí, y también hasta hoy en día nuestra lucha que hemos empezado es gracias a esta planta de conocimiento. Estamos aquí defendiendo el territorio, porque nuestro territorio no solo es nosotros, también hay mucha biodiversidad en el territorio. Por eso defendemos nosotros. Nosotros convivimos con nuestra selva, con nuestro territorio.
He was saying that their resistance is thanks to the presence of this medicinal plant, ayahuasca, which was used by their ancestors and enables them to keep fighting to defend their territory. And it's not just the Sekopai living in their territory. There is a great biodiversity of other beings, and they all coexist together within the territory.
Can I ask, perhaps, Bethany, for you to, I wish we had more time, but could you perhaps ask Jimmy if there's one thing that the people participating today can do to help? What would that be, or what should we do to intervene here?
La gente que están como viendo esta llamada, Jimmy, que están participando, la gente como en otros países, ¿qué pueden hacer para apoyar tu lucha?
Sí, una de las cosas que nosotros necesitamos aquí, que nuestra voz para que llegue, es poder compartir nuestras voces, nuestros propios proyectos que estamos lanzando desde el territorio. Nosotros hemos iniciado un proyecto de educación y necesitamos apoyo para proteger este territorio, ¿no? Entonces, nosotros hemos creado una ONG de la comunidad, con la visión de la comunidad, con la visión del pueblo, y necesitamos apoyo para que eso sea realidad. Y hemos tenido mucha dificultad frente al Estado ecuatoriano. ¿Qué pasa? Nos discrimina sistemáticamente en la actualidad. Ese ha sido el gran reto para nosotros.
So Jimmy was saying there are a couple of things people can do. First of all, share Jimmy's voice. The interview in Index on Censorship, for example, he was saying it is hard as an indigenous person to be heard. So the first thing people can do is just share the voice of Jimmy and his community. He was also saying that they have created an NGO, the Sarah Foundation, which I was just talking about, which works in the area of audiovisual and education. We've got a crowdfunding campaign going for that foundation. And he was also saying that he has himself experienced being silenced as an indigenous person because the government has made it very difficult for him and his colleagues to move forward with the paperwork for their NGO, which is another way of being silenced when you're kind of prevented from realizing your activities, essentially. So they basically just put all kinds of bureaucratic obstacles in the way of this foundation, which he and his young colleagues have created.
Thank you very much. And I was just wondering, one of the things I wanted to do in the original format of the discussion was to bring you in, Steven, to address Jimmy and to give your thoughts and responses to what he was saying. I mean, you've heard his words through Bethany's piece. I just wondered whether you had any words for Jimmy.
Thank you, Martin, and hello, Jimmy. Welcome back. I just want to say that I think what I'm taking from Jimmy's words and today is the resilience and the courage and the strength and the leadership of Jimmy and his people. And I've seen this time and time again on my 250 plus trips down to this region. I live in New York. I travel down there. I used to, at least, like, you know, like people would fly from New York to Washington, D.C. or something. I mean, I went frequently. And it always amazes me that despite being really violently attacked by the oil industry, and by all sorts of outside forces that have intervened in what was once a pristine ecosystem that sustained human life to the maximum degree, the cultures have survived. And the cultures have set themselves up to restore, at least to a great degree, if not completely, what they once had, because they have been able to get through these attacks by Texaco, Chevron, and other oil companies. There's enough there's enough there to build on if we can get the fossil fuel industry to stay out of this region and really restore what once was to a great degree. And I'm really proud of Jimmy and his people.
Can I just allow Bethany to translate at least the gist of?
Sorry, I should have spoken
No
in
problem.
snippets. My apologies.
Don't worry.
Steven dijo que él ha visitado Ecuador más que 200 veces en este como tiempo. Realmente ha sido inspirado por la valentía, resiliencia y dirigencia de las comunidades que han como sobrevivido a pesar de como unos ataques violentos por parte del petroleros, y que está siempre muy impresionado en su como su determinación de como cuidar y renovar sus territorios.
Okay, thank you very, very, very much, Bethany. We are over time, and so I would like to wrap up. I do need to thank our speakers today who've been fantastic. Thank you as well to people who've come in and for the large part stayed with us. I also need to thank our sponsors today, Clifford Chance and Sage. And I really hope that we can continue. I'm determined to continue to pursue this this subject within Index on Censorship. It's really, really important. And if you want to stay updated on our work, please subscribe to Index on Censorship at www.indexoncensorship.org. We're absolutely determined that the voices of Indigenous peoples will continue to be heard through the pages of Index on Censorship. So thank you very much for attending today. And again, thank you very much to all our speakers.
Thank you.
Thank you for inviting us.